The South Atlantic, in 1982, was a lonely expanse of cold, steel-gray water. Winds slid across its surface like invisible blades, cutting through the waves and howling past the hulls of ships that had come from half a world away. It was May, a month of mist and drizzle, and the British fleet had gathered under somber skies, its decks glistening with salt and rain. Somewhere beyond that gray horizon lay the Falkland Islands, small, windswept, and suddenly, the center of the world's attention. From the air, those islands looked insignificant, mere dots scattered across the cold. Yet for the men aboard both the British and Argentine ships, they were everything. Pride, honor, sovereignty, all condensed into this lonely patch of rock and grass at the end of the earth. It began quietly, as many wars do. But by late April, the calm had cracked. Argentina had seized the islands, and Britain, with the Royal Navy at its heart, was sailing to take them back. Among the waves and cloud cover, an unexpected enemy waited, not a massive fleet, not superior firepower, but a handful of young Argentine pilots flying outdated aircraft, the Douglas A-4 Skyhawks. They were small, single-seat attack planes built for speed and courage more than comfort. Their paint faded, their engines old, their radar nearly obsolete. But in the hands of the Argentine pilots, most of them in their 20s, some barely trained for sea combat, these planes would become instruments of astonishing daring. As I sifted through faded photographs of those pilots, some smiling in flight suits, others standing barefoot on rough tarmac, I could not help but feel a quiet reverence. They looked so young. There was something almost boyish in their eyes, as though they had not yet learned what the sea demanded of men. Yet they flew into what even seasoned aviators called madness. One of them, Lieutenant Mariano Velasco, wrote in his diary on May 23, 1982, "The sea looks like silver from up here. The wind shakes the wings, but I keep my eyes on the horizon. Somewhere out there are the ships. I think of home, the trees of Cordoba, my mother's cooking. Then I push the throttle. The time for thinking ends." That silver sea below him was no calm mirror, though it might have appeared so at altitude. Beneath the cloud layer, radar operators aboard British destroyers scanned their screens, watching for sudden flickers, small dots that meant Skyhawks were coming. The British task force was vast, disciplined, and powerful. It carried aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, and supply ships, the largest British naval expedition since World War II. Against it, Argentina had only a small navy and a handful of aircraft capable of reaching the fleet. Yet, the Argentines had something that could not be measured by tonnage or technology: desperation, and with it, a rare kind of bravery. Each mission the Skyhawks flew was nearly suicidal. They had to take off from the mainland, fly over hundreds of miles of open ocean, evade radar, dive to almost wave-top height to avoid detection, and then attack ships defended by state-of-the-art anti-air systems. Every second counted. Every drop of fuel mattered. If they were hit, there would be no rescue, no parachute recovery, no chance of return. Just the cold, endless Atlantic. Still, they went. In the first weeks of May, the British fleet established its exclusion zone. The air was filled with tension, electronic beeps, radio static, the hum of engines, and the unspoken knowledge that something catastrophic could happen at any moment. For many sailors, it felt like standing inside the eye of a storm, waiting for its walls to close in. And close in they did. The Skyhawks began their raids, small groups of 3 or 4 aircraft flying low and fast, their bombs armed by hand, their targets spotted through sheer eyesight rather than radar. The British called them ants attacking an elephant. But these ants had stingers. On May 21, near San Carlos Water, a narrow inlet the British used for landing troops, the Skyhawks came roaring in. They flew so low that their wingtips almost kissed the waves. British soldiers on the decks could see their faces as they passed, calm, focused, and terribly young. Explosions tore through the air. Bombs struck HMS Ardent, and within minutes, the frigate was ablaze. One sailor later wrote, "It was like the sea itself had caught fire." 22 crewmen were lost. Others were rescued from the flaming decks, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide with disbelief. The Skyhawks had struck, and vanished, before the smoke had cleared. Back at their base, the Argentine pilots returned one by one, or sometimes not at all. Some planes never made it back across the sea. Fuel ran out, engines failed, or they were caught by Sea Harriers, the British fighter jets that prowled the skies. Yet those who survived flew again the next day. The rhythm of the war began to change. The Royal Navy grew cautious, its ships spreading out, its anti-aircraft gunners scanning every cloud. But even the best defenses could not stop every low-flying plane. The ocean was too vast, the weather too unpredictable, and the Skyhawks too determined. As the days passed, the sea became a graveyard of twisted metal, both British and Argentine. Yet beneath the smoke and fire, there was a strange respect brewing on both sides. One British sailor wrote home, "They come at us with nothing but guts and old planes. You can't help but admire that. It was courage, pure and quiet, the kind that blooms not from glory, but from duty." And as May turned toward June, the Skyhawks prepared for their most daring assault yet, one that would etch their name into the history of naval warfare. May 25, 1982, Dia de la Patria, Argentina's National Day. Across the vast South Atlantic, the wind carried the scent of rain and burnt fuel. Clouds stretched low and heavy, like gray curtains over a trembling stage. On this day of national pride, many Argentine families in Buenos Aires were listening to the radio, hearing bulletins of the war far away, names of ships, names of pilots, half-whispered prayers. And on that morning, hundreds of miles to the south, Lieutenant Mariano Velasco and his fellow Skyhawk pilots were preparing for what would become the most famous attack of the Falklands War. Their target was not yet known to them, but somewhere out in the cold sea, two British ships were moving in defensive formation, HMS Coventry, a Type 42 destroyer, and HMS Broadsword, a Type 22 frigate. Together they formed a trap, known to their crews as the Coventry Trap. Coventry's role was to protect the British amphibious landings at San Carlos. She was armed with the Sea Dart missile system, long-range and deadly, designed to strike aircraft before they ever reached bombing distance. Broadsword, meanwhile, carried the shorter-range Seawolf system, capable of quick, automatic bursts to intercept missiles or planes. Together, they were meant to be invincible, a shield over the cold water. But war, like the sea, has a way of surprising even the strongest vessels. That morning, Coventry's radar screens flickered to life. The crew could sense it, that quiet tension, the kind sailors feel when the air itself seems to hold its breath. On the bridge, Captain David Hartdyke stood calm, a man of measured confidence. He had been at sea for years, and his men trusted him. But even he could sense the growing unease. In the sky, Lieutenant Velasco and his three wingmen, Lieutenants Castillo, Assis, and Rinca, flew in formation, their A-4 Skyhawks painted in faded camouflage, each carrying 3 500-pound bombs. They had been briefed at Rio Gallegos Air Base only hours before: fly low, stay together, hit the ships, and return, if you can. Velasco's log entry, later recovered, contained just a single line for that morning. "We fly into history today." The journey to the target zone was long and perilous. The Skyhawks skimmed the waves, flying at altitudes so low that sea spray splattered across their canopies. They followed the curve of the earth, invisible to radar, guided only by instinct, training, and the faint voice of the ground controller over radio static. Each minute stretched like an hour. Fuel was precious. There was no margin for error. If they were detected early, the British Sea Dart missiles would cut through the sky before the pilots could even see their targets. Far away, aboard HMS Coventry, the crew was on high alert. Radar operators spotted flickers, first faint, then growing, moving fast and low. The alarm sounded. Orders rang out across the decks. Gun crews scrambled to their positions, missiles were armed, and radar dishes spun frantically through the mist. But then, the dots vanished. The Skyhawks had dropped below radar altitude again, skimming just meters above the waves. Coventry's systems lost them in the sea clutter. The ship turned slightly north to reset her position, unaware that the maneuver would expose her flank, her vulnerable side, to the oncoming planes. Velasco and his formation broke through the low cloud. Suddenly, the gray horizon opened up, and there they were, two shapes gliding through the sea spray, steel against silver. Coventry and Broadsword. Velasco's heart raced, but his voice on the intercom was calm. Objetivo a la vista. Attack run. Attack run. He pulled up slightly, aligning his sights. The world slowed. The sea shimmered below. Tracers from British guns streaked through the air like orange comets. The Skyhawks roared into the fire. From Coventry's deck, sailors watched in disbelief as the planes came in so low, so fast, that their guns could barely depress enough to fire. The destroyer's Sea Dart system, built for high-altitude threats, could not lock on. Broadsword's Sea Wolf system tried to engage, but as fate would have it, the computer froze at the worst possible moment. The ship's defense went silent. Velasco dove in. At 50 feet above the waves, he released his bombs. 1, 2, 3, and then pulled hard, the G-forces pressing against his chest. Seconds later, the first bomb struck Coventry's port side. Then another. The sound was deafening, a deep, metallic thunder that rolled across the sea. Flames burst from the destroyer's hull. Men were thrown from their feet, alarms screamed, and black smoke poured from the ship's core. Within moments, Coventry began to list sharply to port. Inside, sailors struggled to escape flooding compartments as fires spread. Captain Hartdyke gave the order to abandon ship. The sea swallowed the destroyer within 20 minutes. She rolled onto her side and disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind only oil, debris, and the cries of men in the freezing water. 19 sailors were lost. 262 were pulled from the sea by Broadsword's boats and helicopters. From above, Velasco and his surviving wingmen saw the smoke and rising fireball behind them. One of them whispered over the radio. "We did it, but at what cost?" It was victory and tragedy intertwined, the kind of moment only war can produce. They had struck one of the Royal Navy's most advanced ships with second-hand aircraft and near-obsolete bombs. But back home, many of their comrades were gone. For every successful mission, another squadron did not return. That evening, the Argentine news declared it a great triumph, the sinking of a major British warship on their national day. Across Argentina, families cheered and wept at once. Mothers who had sons in the Air Force prayed harder that night, staring at the radios like they were lifelines. And in Britain, the news hit like a shadow across the fleet. HMS Coventry had been a symbol of strength, of modern naval power. Her loss sent a ripple through every deck, every mess hall, every letter home. Yet, even among the British, there was respect, grudging, solemn respect, for the courage of the men who had attacked her. In the cold light of dawn the next day, pieces of Coventry still floated on the water, glinting faintly in the pale sun. The war was not over, not yet. But something had changed. The British fleet, once confident, now moved with caution. The sea had shown that even giants could bleed. And somewhere back on the Argentine mainland, Lieutenant Velasco sat quietly in his bunk, his flight suit still smelling of jet fuel and salt. In his hand was a small, torn photograph of his family. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stared, through the image, through the walls, through the memories that would not leave him. The war, for him, would never truly end. The morning after the sinking of HMS Coventry was strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the sea, still restless, pretends to be calm. Gray clouds hung low over the South Atlantic. Bits of charred debris floated aimlessly, bumping against each other like lost memories. A few pieces of burned metal, a twisted ladder, a blackened shoe, a fragment of painted hull, drifted through the cold swells. The sea had taken its toll, and now it carried its reminders like unspoken words. Far to the west, aboard the carrier HMS Hermes, sailors went about their duties with hushed tones. Coffee cups clinked, boots echoed on metal floors, and somewhere deep in the ship's heart, a chaplain whispered prayers for the 19 men lost with Coventry. Their names were read softly, one by one. And then, as tradition required, a bell was struck for each. I often imagine those bells, faint but enduring, their sound mixing with the sea breeze, reaching places where no words could go. If the ocean has ghosts, perhaps they rise at the sound of that bell. Meanwhile, across the continent, the news of the sinking swept through Argentina like a flame through dry grass. In Buenos Aires, radios blared patriotic songs. Newspapers ran bold headlines. Nuestros pilotos hunden destructor Ingles. Our pilots sink English destroyer. In the cafes of Córdoba, people lifted their cups in quiet pride. Mothers smiled through tears, imagining their sons triumphant. But in the airbases along Argentina's cold southern coast, there was no celebration, only silence. Lieutenant Mariano Velasco, the pilot whose bombs had sealed Coventry's fate, sat on a metal chair outside the hangar at Rio Gallegos. His flight suit was unzipped, his gloves still tucked into his belt. The air smelled of kerosene and sea salt. Mechanics moved quietly around him, their eyes cast downward. He looked out toward the horizon, where the gray of the land met the gray of the sea. In his hand he held a folded note, a message from the command office commending him for extraordinary bravery. He did not smile. In later interviews, Velasco rarely spoke about that day. When he did, his words were measured, almost reverent. "It was our duty," he said softly. "Nothing more, nothing less. We were not heroes. We were men trying to survive." And yet, history has, on the British side, the loss of Coventry forced difficult reflection. The Royal Navy had sailed to the Falklands confident in its strength, but the Skyhawks, flying low and fearless, had revealed something humbling. Even the most advanced warship was vulnerable to courage, precision, and chance. In the wardroom of HMS Broadsword, Captain Mike Layard gathered his officers. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the ship the only sound. "We underestimated them," he said finally. "Never again." That phrase, "never again," became the quiet mantra of the task force. Ships adjusted their formations, radar operators worked double shifts, and the air defenses were fine-tuned. But deep down, everyone knew that the real enemy wasn't just the aircraft, it was the vastness of the sea, the fog that blinded instruments, and the cruel unpredictability of war. The Falklands conflict was unlike the naval battles of World War II, yet its spirit echoed the same fears. The cold, the isolation, the endless waiting. Letters home spoke of the world feeling small, a patch of ocean so distant, yet so consuming that it swallowed all sense of time. One sailor wrote in his diary, "The horizon never changes. We keep watching it as though it will tell us something. Sometimes I think it's watching us instead." In Buenos Aires, the government hailed the victory as a turning point. But for the young pilots, the reality was far less triumphant. The Skyhawk squadrons were dwindling, each mission meant fewer planes returning. They had no air refueling, no modern radar, no escaped routes. Every sortie felt like flipping a coin between life and death, yet they kept flying. Velasco's next few missions were routine patrols, no confirmed hits, but constant danger. The enemy was adapting. The British Sea Harriers, with their vertical takeoff and tight maneuvering, began to prowl the skies more aggressively. Each day the window of opportunity narrowed. Each day, more Argentine pilots failed to return. One mechanic at Rio Gallegos, a young man named Rojas, later recalled, "We stopped painting names on the planes. It felt wrong. Like writing on tombstones." And yet, amid the exhaustion, something else began to bloom: respect. A strange, quiet respect between enemies who would never meet. When Coventry went down, some British sailors reported seeing the attacking planes veer away without further aggression, as though acknowledging that enough had been done. Later, Argentine pilots spoke of sorrow at seeing their bombs strike home. They knew the men aboard those ships were like them, tired, cold, and doing their duty. History, when stripped of politics and pride, becomes a mirror of humanity. And in that mirror both sides saw themselves. Weeks passed. The war raged on. The battles at sea gave way to the bitter fighting on land: Goose Green, Mount Tumbledown, Port Stanley. The Skyhawks flew fewer missions now, the airfields were under threat. But the story of Coventry lingered, echoing through both navies as a symbol of what courage could achieve, and what it could destroy. By early June, the end was near. The British were closing in on Stanley. The Argentines were exhausted, their resources thin, their spirits stretched taut. Still, pilots like Velasco readied their aircraft each dawn, the hangar doors opening to the same gray light, the same cold wind off the sea. They knew what awaited them. And they went anyway. That, perhaps, is the part that lingers longest when I revisit this story, not the fire, not the sinking, not even the victory, but the silence afterward. The way the sea returned to calm. The way men on both sides watched the horizon and wondered if the ocean itself mourned for them. War ends. The waves keep rolling. By the first week of June 1982, the South Atlantic had begun to darken under winter skies. The wind was sharper now, cutting through flight suits and canvas tents, making the metal of every ship feel like ice beneath the fingertips. The once restless sea now seemed weary, as though it too longed for the fighting to stop. It had been just over 2 months since the war began. Yet for the men who lived it, time had dissolved into a blur of engine noise, salt, and sleeplessness. The days were measured not in hours, but in sorties and shifts, in letters from home and names crossed off duty rosters. The British task force was now entrenched in the waters around the Falklands. The amphibious landings had succeeded, though not without pain. Smoke still rose from the wrecks at San Carlos Water, a graveyard of burned-out ships, their skeletons visible through the mist. Ardent, Antelope, Coventry, names that had once been spoken with confidence, now murmured with quiet reverence. Each of them told the same story, that war, even with all its modern machinery, still bowed before courage and chaos. On the Argentine mainland, in the cold corridors of Rio Gallegos Air Base, the atmosphere was changing. The pilots, once animated and determined, had grown quieter. Each new mission briefing felt heavier than the last. They knew the British were closing in. The Sea Harriers ruled the skies now. Their ships had drawn closer to Stanley, the capital of the islands. Fuel was running low. Spare parts were scarce. Radios crackled with interference. Yet even as the walls closed in, the Skyhawk pilots continued to prepare for flight. The sound of the ground crews, the hiss of compressors, the clank of tools, echoed through the hangars like a ritual that must be continued, even when the gods have stopped listening. Lieutenant Mariano Velasco, the man who had struck Coventry, flew only once more before the end. The mission was uneventful, a reconnaissance patrol that returned early due to worsening weather. When he landed, the wind had picked up so fiercely that his aircraft shook on the tarmac like a restless animal. He sat in the cockpit for a long time, even after the engine had gone silent. The silence, he would later say, was the hardest part. That silence was spreading now, like fog rolling in over the sea. Meanwhile, aboard HMS Hermes, the British flagship, word of the approaching end began to drift through the corridors. Officers spoke cautiously, avoiding the word victory, as if to say it aloud might invite misfortune. The men were exhausted. Some had not seen sunlight in weeks, their skin pale beneath the harsh glow of fluorescent lamps. In the wardroom, a handful of sailors gathered each night to play cards, their laughter muted. Others wrote letters home. The tone of those letters had changed, less about glory, more about longing. "We just want it to be over," one sailor wrote to his wife. "We've seen enough steel turn to smoke." Outside, the sea was deceptively beautiful. There were days when it shone like glass, so smooth it reflected the gray sky perfectly. The air was heavy with salt and the faint scent of oil. From the deck, the distant Falklands looked peaceful, small, green, and fragile beneath the drifting clouds. But the men who would fight for them still waited, each day wondering if it would be their last. The final phase of the conflict unfolded quickly. The British land campaign, harsh, cold, and fought on foot through mud and rock, pushed the Argentine defenders back towards Stanley. The air raids that had once terrified the British fleet grew fewer and farther between. By early June, Argentina's air force had lost over half its operational aircraft. Many pilots never returned. Their names would later be etched into plaques and whispered into the wind that still sweeps across Patagonia. Those who remained were told to stand down. Fuel shortages made further operations nearly impossible. And yet some refused to stop. Even as command ordered them to conserve what little they had left, a few Skyhawks took off without clearance, circling the coast as if unwilling to accept the stillness that followed. For pilots like Velasco, the war had become more than strategy. It was memory, grief, and duty all mixed together. The cockpit had become their only constant. The sea, their only audience. On June 14, 1982, the guns finally fell silent. The Argentine garrison at Stanley surrendered. For the British, the war had lasted 74 days. For those who lived it, it would last much longer. Aboard HMS Hermes, the news spread in waves, disbelief first, then relief. Sailors gathered on deck, some cheering, others standing quietly with tears on their faces. The cold wind blew across their uniforms, carrying away the sound of celebration into the gray. Somewhere out at sea, small fires still burned on wreckage that refused to sink. Captain David Hartdyke, who had survived the sinking of Coventry, received the news in a hospital bed aboard a medical ship. His burns had begun to heal, though the memories had not. When asked how he felt about the war's end, he simply said, "Grateful for the living, haunted by the rest." And so, the Falklands War closed not with a grand finale, but with a quiet exhale. Ships turned toward home. Flags were lowered. Men packed their duffel bags in silence. When Hermes finally sailed north, the waves broke softly against her hull. The sea-birds followed for a time, then drifted away. On the horizon, the sky cleared, the first real sunlight many of the men had seen in months. In Argentina, there was no such sunlight. The surrender announcement came over the radio, brief and sober. Crowds gathered in the streets of Buenos Aires, some shouting in anger, others standing in stunned silence. The pilots who returned from the south were treated as heroes by their comrades, but the glow of victory was gone. Their country was in mourning. Velasco arrived home days later. His uniform was still creased from the flight. When his mother opened the door, she did not speak, she only held him. For a long while, they stood together in the doorway, the sound of the wind outside their only witness. He would never fly a combat mission again. I once read that the sea has a perfect memory, that it keeps everything, every sound and shadow, deep beneath its surface. Perhaps that is why the South Atlantic remains so eerily quiet even now. Beneath those waves lie fragments of ships, torn fuselages, and stories that never reached shore. The war lasted 74 days. But for those who fought, the echoes have lasted a lifetime. The weather over the South Atlantic was deceptive that morning, calm, silver, and innocent. Yet beneath that soft, washed-out sky, history was preparing to turn its quiet page. The British fleet, scattered and watchful, floated under low clouds off the coast of the Falklands. The ship's decks gleamed wet with mist, radar dishes rotating like the slow eyes of great sea beasts. In the distance, over 200 miles away, a squadron of Argentine A-4 Skyhawks was already slicing through the morning haze. Their engines growled low, their wings carrying a weight heavier than bombs, the weight of impossible odds. Each pilot knew what he faced. The British fleet was not a wandering armada. It was a fortress of steel, guarded by destroyers bristling with Sea Dart and Sea Wolf missiles. Yet, the Argentines came anyway. Lieutenant Mariano Velasco, flying an A-4C that morning, later said the air felt strangely still. As if the wind itself was watching. He could see the faint shimmer of the ocean below, the rolling fog like sheets of glass. Around him, his wingmen flew low, almost skimming the waves. It was a tactic they'd learned the hard way: stay low, beneath the radar, in the ocean's embrace. One mistake, one rise too soon, and British radar would lock on. Then came the hiss, the missile, and the sudden silence. The Skyhawks were light and fast, relics of the 1950s compared to the sleek Harriers and missile systems of their enemies. They carried no radar of their own, no defensive flares. Their strategy was raw courage: fly low, strike fast, and hope the sea would hide them. That morning, their target was HMS Coventry, a Type 42 destroyer, powerful and proud, stationed northwest of the islands alongside HMS Broadsword. The two ships were partners, one carrying the heavy long-range missiles, the other equipped with rapid anti-aircraft defenses. Together, they formed a shield for the rest of the British fleet. But in the fog of war, even the sharpest shields can fail. As the Argentine formation neared the combat zone, Velasco's voice broke over the radio, calm but tight. "Maintain altitude. The radar horizon is close." They were 50 feet above the sea, a heartbeat from disaster, a heartbeat from victory. The ocean's spray kissed their canopies. Back aboard Coventry, radar screens flickered with intermittent blips, low, uncertain, vanishing and reappearing like ghosts. "Possible sea clutter," one operator muttered. But the air watch officer wasn't so sure. He'd seen this before, the faint tremor of something alive beneath the storm. "Contact, low bearing 280, came the report. "Possible inbound aircraft." The alarm klaxon began its slow wail, not frantic, but steady, like the toll of a warning bell. Sailors dashed to battle stations. Guns powered up. The calm ocean was suddenly full of purpose. The captain of Coventry, John Coward, issued his order with restrained precision. "Action stations. All eyes west." And then, nothing. For a few minutes the sky was silent, as if the attack had evaporated. Then, from the western fog, 3 dark silhouettes burst into view, low and fast. The gunners opened fire. The sound was immense, a deep, trembling thunder that echoed across the waves. Tracer rounds streaked into the mist. The Skyhawks did not turn away. They came head-on, almost level with the water, the roar of their engines blending with the growl of the sea. Velasco remembered the flash of the destroyer's guns, the orange bursts in the gray light. He dove even lower, heart pounding, vision narrowing. Behind him, one of his comrades was hit, a spray of flame and metal, but the others pressed on. Coventry's Sea Dart missiles launched, streaking upward into the clouds. One missed. The second lost lock as the Skyhawks dropped beneath the radar again. Broadsword attempted to fire her Sea Wolf system, the ship's defense against low-altitude attacks, but fate intervened. At that exact moment, the system froze. A computer glitch, a fatal pause. The crew tried to reboot, fingers trembling over manual Velasco pulled up slightly, lined up the gray shape of Coventry in his sights, and released his bombs. The aircraft lurched as its load fell away. He didn't wait to see. He banked hard and fled low over the waves, engines screaming. Behind him, seconds stretched into eternity. Then came the sound, not a single explosion, but a rolling, thunderous crack that seemed to split the air. 2 1,000-pound bombs struck Coventry. One tore through her side and exploded in the engineering spaces. The second detonated near the operations room. Within seconds, fire and smoke consumed her midsection. From Broadsword, sailors watched in stunned silence as Coventry listed sharply to port. The great destroyer's proud silhouette faltered. Her bow rose, her stern sank. Men scrambled across the tilted decks, diving into the sea as flames reached the bridge. It was 15:45 hours on May 25, 1982, Argentina's National Day. The irony was not lost on those who survived. As Coventry rolled over, the ocean swallowed her in a hiss of steam. She sank within 20 minutes. 19 of her crew went down with her. Velasco's Skyhawk limped home across the Atlantic winds, fuel running low, warning lights flashing. He did not know then what his bombs had done. Only later, when he landed and removed his helmet, did a young mechanic whisper, "You got her, sir." But in his heart, Velasco felt no triumph, only the quiet exhaustion of a man who had faced death and lived. "We did our duty," he said years later. And so did they. War, after all, is not measured in victories alone, but in the silences that follow them. As the waves closed over HMS Coventry, the sea seemed to draw a long, weary breath. And that, perhaps, was the cruel symmetry of the Falklands War, moments of heroism that looked the same on both sides of the horizon. The sea that morning was a mirror. Flat, quiet, almost unnaturally still, as if the South Atlantic itself was holding its breath. On HMS Sheffield, sailors moved through their routines with the ease that comes only after long weeks at sea. The coffee urn steamed in the wardroom. Someone was tuning a radio to the BBC World Service. And above them all, the ship hummed with quiet, living machinery, radar pulses, low engine rumble, the metallic heartbeat of a vessel at war but at peace for the moment. It was May 4th, 1982, just 21 days before Coventry would fall. The Falklands campaign was still in its feverish early days. Sheffield had been part of the initial task force sent to the South Atlantic to reclaim the islands. She was a proud ship, a Type 42 destroyer, built for speed and air defense. Her gray hull had cut through many seas before, but few of her crew could have guessed that today, under a pale southern sun, they would become part of naval history. Far to the west, over the Argentine mainland, 2 aircraft sat ready on a tarmac shimmering with heat. They were French-built super-attendants, sleek, angular, and deadly. Beneath each one hung a weapon that the world would soon come to fear, the AM-39 Exocet missile. For weeks, Argentine pilots had been training with these missiles, studying the British fleet's patterns, searching for a weakness. The Exocet was no ordinary weapon. It skimmed the sea at supersonic speed, hugging the waves, almost invisible to radar. It didn't attack from above like traditional bombs. It crept close to the surface, found its target, and struck at the waterline, where steel was most vulnerable. At 10:35 a.m., the 2 attendants took off, their engines roaring soft. Back aboard Sheffield, radar operators watched their screens with professional vigilance. The air was tense, but not alarmed. Other ships, HMS Glasgow and HMS Brilliant, were nearby, and the British task force had grown confident in its radar coverage. The Exocet threat was known, yes, but distant, something theoretical, something the Royal Navy believed it could handle. At 10:50, Sheffield received a message from Glasgow, possible missile launch detected. But communications in the fog of war are never perfect. The message was garbled. The radar return seemed uncertain. Some believed it was a false alarm, a phantom echo caused by sea clutter. The ship's captain, Sam Salt, weighed the evidence carefully. They were already tracking a British Sea Harrier patrol returning to the carrier group. It was easy to mistake one radar signature for another. At 10:55 a.m., Sheffield's radar picked up a faint, flickering contact, something low, fast, and approaching. There was barely time to react. The lookouts saw it first, a silver dart skimming over the waves, trailing a thin white mist. The Exocet missile was already within sight before anyone could shout its name. There was no cinematic build-up, no swelling music, no hero's chance to aim and fire. The missile struck Sheffield on the starboard side, just below the bridge. The impact was solid but strangely quiet, a dull, heavy thud that echoed through the hull. Then came the silence. For a few seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Men looked at each other in confusion. "Is that it?" someone whispered. Then came the smell. It began as a faint whiff of burnt rubber, then thickened into the acrid sting of burning fuel. The Exocet's warhead had not exploded, but its remaining fuel ignited instantly, flooding compartments with fire and toxic smoke. Within minutes, the interior of Sheffield became an inferno. Flames raced through wiring conduits and ventilation ducts. Black smoke filled the passageways, choking visibility. Sailors crawled along the decks, gasping, trying to find escape routes. The fire control systems, ironically, had been disabled by the initial impact. Water pressure failed. Fire extinguishers were useless against the spreading blaze. Captain Salt ordered an immediate evacuation. The crew obeyed with quiet discipline. There were no screams, no chaos, just the muffled shouts of men calling names, helping each other through the smoke. Some leapt overboard into the cold, oil-slicked water below. Others remained behind to try and contain the flames, fighting an enemy that had no shape. From nearby ships, sailors watched helplessly as the gray destroyer burned. The fire rose from her midsection in dark columns, the wind carrying the smell of fuel and scorched paint across the water. The sight was surreal. A warship, alive just minutes ago, now glowing like a torch against the calm sea. HMS Arrow and Yarmouth rushed to assist, pulling survivors from the water. The wounded shivered under wool blankets, their faces streaked with soot and salt. One man, clutching a broken helmet, murmured softly, "Sheffield's gone, she's gone." By late afternoon, the fire had burned itself out. Sheffield was still afloat, but she was dying. Her hull was warped, her systems dead. Efforts to tow her failed. On May 10th, 6 days after the strike, she slipped beneath the waves. 20 of her crew were lost. 20 names that would later be carved into plaques, remembered not as victims, but as sailors who faced the unimaginable with composure. When I read the logs and survivor accounts from that day, one detail haunts me most. Amid the smoke and confusion, a young sailor named David Hunt wrote a note in his pocket diary. "The sea looks peaceful again." Just that. A sentence written while his world burned around him. It reminds me how war can wrap the ordinary in unbearable contrast. Fire against calm water, courage against futility, life against the vast indifference of the ocean. The sinking of Sheffield was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point. It forced the Royal Navy to confront a new era of warfare, one where invisible missiles could destroy a warship before a single shot was fired in reply. Electronic countermeasures, radar systems, and fleet tactics would all evolve because of that one strike. But for those who served on her, Sheffield was not an abstract lesson. She was a home, a memory, a sound of footsteps in narrow halls, a smell of coffee and metal and salt. When I imagine that ship now, I picture her not as she burned, but as she once was, cutting through the South Atlantic in grey majesty, her ensign rippling in the wind. The deadliest weapons of war may claim victory, but memory is what gives them meaning. As the sun set over the South Atlantic that evening, the sea turned gold. The waves closed gently over the space where Sheffield had once floated, as if erasing her from sight, but not from time. The end of May in the South Atlantic is a study in contradiction, a season caught between the bite of winter and the lingering whisper of summer. The sea takes on a muted gray-green, and the light feels thinner, as though the sun itself is reluctant to touch the water. The British fleet, hardened by weeks of relentless tension, drifted beneath that pale sky like weary sentinels. The crews had learned to sleep in half-dreams, to eat quickly, to flinch instinctively at the sound of distant engines. The sinking of Sheffield had shaken every sailor in the task force. Not simply for the loss, but for the realization that death could come silently, a glimmer on the radar, a soundless streak across the waves. Yet there was no time for mourning. The war pressed forward. Every day that passed brought the landings closer, and the island's skies were still contested. Across the cold waters, on the Argentine mainland, the pilots of the 5th and 4th Air Brigades were running out of everything: spare parts, fuel, even hope. The engineers patched bullet holes with metal sheets salvaged from wrecks. Ground crews worked through nights without sleep, their breath visible in the cold air as they fueled the last Skyhawks. The pilots gathered in low, dim rooms before dawn, men in their 20s who looked much older now. They studied photographs of British ships, traced attack routes with trembling fingers, and drank bitter coffee that did little to warm them. "We knew," said Lieutenant Gustavo Piuma later, "that every mission could be our last. But it wasn't courage, not really. It was duty. We couldn't let the others go alone." On May 21st, as British forces began their landings at San Carlos Bay, the Argentine Air Force launched wave after wave of attacks. They called it Bomb Alley, a narrow channel surrounded by steep hills, where ships lay exposed while offloading men and supplies. It was a death trap for both sides. The British ships clustered together, their guns firing at every shadow, while the Argentine pilots flew through storms of tracer fire so dense it looked like molten rain. From dawn to dusk, the sky above San Carlos roared with engines. A-4 Skyhawks dove through the clouds in pairs and trios, their bombs armed by simple fuses, their targets glimpsed through smoke. Many didn't return. The British anti-aircraft fire was merciless, a wall of sound and light that tore through the air like a living storm. Yet for every aircraft lost, another came roaring low across the sea, so low that their wingtips sliced the spray. One of the most daring missions came on May 23, an attack against the British presence at Pebble Island, a small airstrip north of West Falkland. The British Special Forces had struck there days earlier, destroying several Argentine aircraft on the ground. Now, the Skyhawks were determined to return the message. 4 A-4Bs, each carrying 3 250-kilogram bombs, took off from Rio Gallegos just after sunrise. The sky was cold, streaked with blue ice clouds. Lieutenant Ernesto Ureta led the flight, his face expressionless behind the tinted visor. The flight across open water was long, nearly an hour at wave-top altitude, their fuel carefully rationed. Every minute was a test of endurance. They flew in silence, except for the occasional radio check. The ocean beneath them was endless and gray. "When you fly that low," Ureta said later, "you begin to feel the sea is alive. You start to think it's watching you." As they neared Pebble Island, they climbed slightly, breaking through a thin fog. Ahead lay the faint outline of the bay, and anchored within it, the dark forms of British ships. The Skyhawks descended again, engines howling, and released their bombs. Columns of water erupted around the vessels. Shrapnel tore through the decks. One of the ships, HMS Antelope, was struck and severely damaged. The Skyhawks turned sharply and fled, hugging the sea again as the ship's guns filled the sky with fire. 2 of them were hit. One pilot ejected, his parachute opened just before he hit the freezing water. The others disappeared into the gray horizon. Back at the airbase, ground crews waited, counting the minutes. When only 2 jets returned, silence fell over the hangar. Mechanics stood still, their hands black with oil and frost. There was no ceremony, no music, just a quiet acknowledgement of loss. In those final days, the Argentine Air Force learned the cruel rhythm of attrition. For every victory, a dozen friends did not come home. And yet, the British sailors who faced them spoke with reluctant admiration. "They came straight at us," one gunner from HMS Fearless recalled. "No hesitation. Just this streak of silver and courage." The war had hardened both sides, but beneath that armor of resolve lay the same human heart, capable of all, even in battle. As the conflict wore on, both nations began to feel the exhaustion. The skies grew emptier. The fuel reserves dwindled. The South Atlantic weather turned colder, with sleet sweeping across the decks and the peaks of East Falkland. By early June, the British land forces had secured beachheads and begun their march toward Port Stanley. The air war, once roaring and furious, was becoming a whisper. But even as the campaign neared its end, the final sorties continued. Pilots still strapped themselves into their battered aircraft, kissed small crosses or family photos before takeoff. On June 8th, in one of the last large-scale air assaults, Argentine Skyhawks struck at ships unloading troops at Bluff Cove. 2 British vessels, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, were hit. The resulting explosions were catastrophic. The fires that followed burned for hours, visible for miles across the grey sea. Dozens of soldiers were lost, young Welsh guardsmen, many barely out of school. The footage, filmed by British journalists, would later haunt both nations, flames against a backdrop of ice-blue water, men diving into the sea, and the helpless beauty of a sunlit tragedy. After that day, even the most determined Argentine pilots began to understand that the war was over. They had done all that could be done. The ocean, once alive with the roar of engines and the scream of missiles, fell silent again. When I imagine those final days, I don't see maps or battles or victory lines. I see faces, of pilots standing on cold runways, of sailors staring into the fog, of men on both sides looking out across the same merciless sea. War, in the end, is not about sides. It's about the fragile persistence of humanity in places that try to erase it. And in the lonely vastness of the South Atlantic, amid the wrecks and the salt and the wind, humanity endured, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. When the guns finally fell silent in June of 1982, the South Atlantic did not rejoice, it exhaled. Slowly. As though the sea itself had been holding its breath through weeks of fire and iron. The islands, wrapped once more in their winds and fog, seemed eerily untouched by all that had happened. The tussocks still bent in the same direction. The penguins still waddled clumsily along the same shores. Yet beneath that deceptive calm, the water held stories, stories of ships that would never sail again, and of men who would never return. In the aftermath of battle, the ocean was both grave and guardian. Divers from both nations would later descend into the cold depths to survey the wrecks. Twisted metal forms lying quiet on the seabed, their guns pointing nowhere, their hulls draped in seaweed like ancient relics. One diver from the Royal Navy described the sight of HMS Coventry lying on her side, her name still faintly visible on the torn steel. "It was like visiting a sleeping giant," he said softly. "A giant who never woke." The ocean does not forget. It keeps everything: uniforms, helmets, letters sealed in air pockets, the half-dissolved silhouettes of ladders and railings. Each shipwreck became a tomb, but also a time capsule, preserved in the dim, drifting light beneath the waves. Above, life continued, haltingly. British forces secured Port Stanley on June 14th, and the Argentine garrison surrendered. The war, which had lasted 74 days, was over. The final casualty lists were read with the detached rhythm of bureaucracy: 649 Argentine dead, 255 British, 3 civilians. Yet every number was a universe, a son, a brother, a name still whispered in dreams. For weeks after the fighting ended, the British sailors and soldiers lived among reminders of what they had survived. The wrecks of Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram still smoldered in Bluff Cove, blackened shells against the winter sky. In San Carlos Bay, the sea was littered with wreckage, fragments of aircraft, scorched life rafts, and twisted metal still gleaming with salt. At night, when the wind howled across the hills, some swore the Argentine pilots who returned home were greeted as heroes, though many could not meet their own reflections. Lieutenant Mariano Velasco, the man who had struck Coventry, was one of them. He returned to a country filled with applause, but found no peace in it. "They cheered," he recalled years later, "but all I could think of were the men on that ship." He visited their names in a memorial years later, running his fingers over each engraved letter. "We shared the same sky," he said. "That's all that matters now." On the British side, survivors carried their memories in silence. Captain Sam Salt of Sheffield never forgot the smell of burning metal and the sound of waves slapping against his ship's ruined hull. For years after, he avoided the sea entirely. Others, younger and less hardened, turned to the only thing that offered release: writing. Many of the diaries recovered from the conflict are startlingly quiet, more about weather and waiting than about fear. One sailor wrote simply, "The fog came back today. It feels like it's covering everything that happened." In London, as the victory parades rolled past cheering crowds, a different kind of silence hung over the veterans' hospitals. Burn victims, amputees, and men with shattered eardrums filled the wards. The nurses spoke softly, aware that the sound of a door closing too sharply could send some of them back to the deck of a burning ship. Yet even amid all that grief, something unspoken emerged: a fragile respect between enemies. In 1998, British veterans and Argentine pilots met for the first time since the war, at a quiet ceremony on the Falklands. The air was cold, and the sea was calm. They stood side by side, some with metal, when one of the Skyhawk pilots, now gray-haired and slow-moving, laid a small model aircraft beside the memorial. A British sailor beside him nodded and whispered, "You were good flyers." The Argentines smiled faintly and replied, "You were better sailors." Then both men laughed, softly, as if afraid to disturb the wind. Time, it seems, had weathered them both into something gentler. Even now, more than 40 years later, the Falklands remain a place of echoes. The islands are quiet again, inhabited mostly by sheep and wind. But if you walk along the western cliffs, where the kelp sways below, you might see shadows beneath the water, the outlines of ships resting far below the surface, visited only by fish and memory. Some of those wrecks are now protected war graves, their coordinates withheld out of respect. Divers who have descended into those depths say the silence there feels heavy, almost sacred. The decks are coated in silt, and anemones bloom where sailors once stood. A few artifacts, mugs, binoculars, even a guitar, still rest where they fell. "It's peaceful," said one diver. "Like the war never reached this deep." Perhaps that's the lesson the ocean teaches best. Everything ends in stillness. Even war. When I think of that quiet seabed, I imagine the ships not as ruins, but as sleeping sentinels, guardians of memory, resting in the eternal cradle of the South Atlantic. And maybe that's how history should be told, not as the noise of victory, but as the calm that follows it. The way the sea closes over the wreckage, not to erase it, but to keep it safe from time. For most men, the journey home from war should be a return, a quiet stepping back into the rhythm of ordinary life. But for those who had fought in the South Atlantic, the voyage home felt like sailing through a dream that refused to end. The ocean that had been their battleground became their only companion on the way back, vast, gray, and indifferent. On the long voyage north, the sea rolled softly beneath the hulls of ships carrying exhausted men. Many sat alone on deck, smoking in silence, their thoughts adrift somewhere between the waves. The war had been short, yet time had stretched strangely in those 74 days, like a string pulled too tight. Some sailors could still hear the roar of the Skyhawks when they closed their eyes. Others said they could feel the thrum of engines in their bones long after the machines had stopped. Even the gentle creak of the ship at night could become an echo of memory, the groan of a dying vessel, the hiss of fire, the distant cries that never really faded. When HMS Hermes and Invincible steamed into Portsmouth Harbor, they were greeted by cheering crowds. Flags waved, brass bands played, and families wept with joy. Yet amid the noise and confetti, many of the returning men stared blankly ahead. They smiled when the cameras turned toward them, but their eyes carried the look of men who had seen something the world would never understand. For the British government, it was a triumph, the kind of swift, decisive victory that restored a nation's pride. But for those who had fought, the medals felt strangely heavy. The faces of fallen comrades haunted them. The explosions replayed endlessly in the quiet moments between sleep and waking. In Argentina, the story was even more complicated. The pilots who had survived returned to a country in mourning and in denial. Their bravery was celebrated, yes, but the government that had sent them to fight was already collapsing. Newspapers printed their faces beside headlines of loss, yet the men themselves received little more than token applause. Many of them were barely 20 years old, boys who had flown into steel storms and survived by miracle. Lieutenant Alfredo Vasquez, who had flown in the attack on Sir Galahad, later said, "We were too young to be heroes, and too proud to be victims." After the war, he found work as a flight instructor, but he never flew combat aircraft again. "Every time I saw clouds," he said, "I remembered the flames." In both nations, veterans spoke little of what they had seen. In Britain, some tried to rebuild their lives quietly. Others found the silence unbearable. A few turned to drink, others to long, lonely walks by the sea. One sailor, interviewed decades later, said, "You can't unhear the sea. It's not the waves, it's the memory of waiting for something to come out of the clouds." There were dreams, too. Many shared the same recurring nightmare, the sky turning white with light, the deck tilting, the water rising fast. Waking felt like surfacing from a long dive. Some found solace in reunions, small gatherings in pubs, decades after the war, where old shipmates would raise glasses to names no one spoke outside those walls. They laughed softly about things that weren't really funny, and when the laughter faded, the silence felt oddly comforting. For the Argentine pilots, healing took a different form. They met each year at a quiet airfield outside Buenos Aires. They would stand beside old Skyhawks now resting on display, touching the worn paint, tracing the numbers they once flew. They didn't talk much about tactics or battles anymore. Instead, they talked about the weather, their family. Over time, some of them made the pilgrimage south, to the Falklands themselves. It was not easy. For years, travel between the nations was steeped in politics. But when it finally became possible, those who returned to the islands found them hauntingly unchanged. The same wind, the same rocks, the same endless gray sea. They visited the graves, rows of white crosses on both sides of the conflict. On the British memorial at San Carlos, where gulls cry overhead, they left flowers. At the Argentine cemetery near Darwin, they knelt in silence. Some wept. Others just listened to the wind. "It's strange," said one British veteran. "You come all this way to pay respects to your enemy, and you realize you're the same men, just on different decks." The sea between them had been both battlefield and bridge. And in time, it became something softer, a shared horizon of memory. Years later, when historians and journalists asked what the war had been like, the answers were never about politics. They were about sounds, the scream of jets, the whine of engines, the hiss of water on hot steel. They were about smells, diesel, smoke, salt, and fear. They were about faces, fleeting, half-lit, remembered only in flashes. And always there was the sea. For those who had survived it, the ocean never stopped speaking. Some said they could still hear the ghosts of the ships beneath the waves, a creak, a sigh, a heartbeat deep below. One diver, who had visited the wreck of Coventry, claimed that the silence down there felt alive. "It hums," he said, "like the ship is still dreaming." Maybe that's what history is, a kind of dream we keep returning to. A dream made of salt and memory, where men are forever young, and the sea never forgets. As the decades passed, the South Atlantic War faded from headlines and classrooms, but not from the people who carried it inside them. Some of the Skyhawk pilots died quietly of old age. Some of the British sailors became grandfathers, their grandchildren unaware that the old man who told bedtime stories once watched the horizon for death. And yet, on anniversaries, they still gather. In Portsmouth. In Buenos Aires. In small seaside towns where the gulls wheel and the wind tastes of salt. They speak softly of ships and friends. They look out at the horizon, where the sky and sea meet in a pale blur, the same horizon that once burned with fire. They stand there for a while. Then someone, always, says what they all feel. "We were lucky!" And the others nod because they know. The sea may have taken their youth, their comrades, and their sleep, but it gave them something in return, a bond stronger than fear, and a silence that no words can fill. When I first began to study the Falklands War, the brief, fierce conflict fought at the edge of the world, I expected to find clear answers, strategies, victories, losses neatly counted. But history rarely obeys the tidy lines we draw for it. What I found instead were echoes, voices carried by salt wind and memory, voices of pilots, sailors, engineers, medics, each recalling fragments of those 74 days when the South Atlantic turned to fire. Decades later, the waves still wash over the wrecks. Down below, the remains of HMS Coventry, Sheffield, Ardent, and Antelope lie like sleeping giants beneath blankets of silt. Fish drift through their corridors, and the metal, once twisted by heat, now rusts in peace. The sea, patient as ever, has begun to reclaim what war took. And yet the ocean remembers. Divers who descend to those sites speak of an otherworldly stillness, a hush so complete it feels sacred. The light fades slowly, filtering down in green beams, catching on a patch of flaking paint or a tangle of wiring. Now and then, a glint of glass, a coffee mug, a control dial, a fragment of a life interrupted. Some divers say it feels wrong to speak down there. Others whisper a greeting, as if the sea itself is listening. At the surface, the world has moved on. The Skyhawks that once roared over the cold waters now sit in museums, their silver bodies dulled by time. Schoolchildren run their hands over the curved metal and look up at the faded Argentine flag on the tail. They cannot imagine the terror or the bravery that once filled those cockpits. In Britain, tourists walk the decks of preserved carriers and frigates, unaware that the steel beneath their feet once trembled under bomb blasts in distant waters. And yet, every year, the stories resurface, retold by survivors, journalists, historians. Each retelling reshapes the memory a little, but the essence remains: courage and tragedy, youth and fire, pride and loss. For Argentina, the war remains a wound woven with pride. The Skyhawk pilots became national symbols of bravery, boys who flew against overwhelming odds. Their names are read aloud on anniversaries. Streets are named for them. Their photographs, in black and white, hang in small museums and schools. But behind every celebration lies a quiet question: what was gained, and what was lost? For Britain, the war reaffirmed something long dormant, a sense of endurance, of maritime identity reborn. The Royal Navy, tested once again after decades of peace, found itself both bloodied and renewed. The men who served became the last of a kind, sailors who fought ship to ship, eye to eye, under open sky. In the years that followed, both nations changed. The war ended dictatorships, revived debates, reshaped politics. But beyond all that, beyond governments, medals, and headlines, it left a quieter legacy, a reminder of how fragile courage is, and how quickly ordinary lives can be caught in history's wind. When I close my eyes and think of those days, I imagine the scene not in color, but in shades of gray, the way memory tends to fade toward the monochrome. I see the Falklands themselves, low islands under a bruised sky, the wind brushing the grass in endless motion. I see the silhouettes of ships against the horizon. I hear the drone of aircraft far away, like distant thunder. And then silence. Because after all the noise of war, silence is what remains. Many of the men who fought there have passed on now. Their stories rest with them, like letters folded in pockets. But history, in its gentle persistence, keeps unfolding them. One Argentine pilot, long retired, once said, "We were not enemies. We were young men sent into the same storm." A British sailor echoed him years later. "They were brave. Too brave. We just happened to be on the other side." In that shared recognition lies something rare, not victory or defeat, but understanding. Perhaps that is what the sea wanted all along. Not to choose sides, but to remind those who crossed it that every act of war is written twice, once in fire, and once in remembrance. When the wind blows across the South Atlantic, it carries with it a strange mix of sounds, the whisper of waves, the call of seabirds, the rustle of distant grass. But if you listen long enough, if you let the sound settle deep within you, you can almost hear another layer, the faint hum of engines that no longer fly, the echo of courage that refuses to fade. The ocean does not forget. It carries memory like salt in its depths, a taste that lingers long after the storm has passed. And so, when I read the names of the ships, Sheffield, Coventry, Ardent, Antelope, Sir Galahad, I don't just hear steel and fire. I hear the beating of hearts, the rush of wind through open canopies, the last radio call before silence. I hear, too, the Skyhawks, their engines rising like a song against impossible odds. In the end, perhaps war is not remembered through victories or borders, but through the small, human details, a letter that never arrived, a voice on the radio saying, "I'm hit," a photograph left in a locker, the scent of oil and salt mingling at dawn. And beyond all that, the sea. Always the sea. The sea that swallowed ships and dreams alike. The sea that keeps its secrets, even as it whispers them back to us through the years. I sometimes imagine that, somewhere out there, under the rolling gray waves of the South Atlantic, those ships still sail, quiet now, their lights dim but steady, their decks washed clean by time. And above them, the Skyhawks glide once more, not in attack, but in eternal flight, young pilots caught forever between sky and sea. There is a kind of peace that only comes after fire, a peace that does not forget what was burned, but accepts it gently. The Falklands War, brief as it was, left behind that kind of peace. It drifts now through the South Atlantic like fog at dawn, soft, persistent, unspoken. In that peace live the spirits of all who flew, sailed, and fell. They linger not in anger, but in remembrance. For history, like the sea, never ends, it only moves in waves. And if you stand at the edge of the world, where the cold wind bites and the ocean sighs, you might feel it, the heartbeat of old engines, the pulse of courage long spent, the quiet promise that memory will endure. The ships rest, the pilots sleep, the waters close above them. Yet their story, the day the A-4 Skyhawks sank British warships, still shimmers beneath the surface of time. Not as a tale of victory or defeat, but as a testament to what human hearts can dare, and what they must bear. So let us leave them there, under the endless southern sky, where light meets the sea in silence. And let the ocean remember.